The canyon was alive with the sound of rushing water. Spring had brought floods, and the once gentle river was now a beast unchained, its silver body writhing with froth and fury. The air smelled of damp earth and pine sap, and the late sun bled across the horizon, painting the world in amber fire. Clara had always loved this place, had grown up walking these banks, had even whispered her childhood dreams to the water when no one else would listen. But today, the river was not her confidant. Today, it was her enemy. She hadn't meant to slip. It was just a loose stone, the kind worn smooth by centuries of current. One misstep, one gasp, and suddenly her feet were gone from under her. The icy shock of the water stole the scream from her lips, dragging her beneath its furious surface. Her arms flailed, desperate for something, anything to hold on to. But the current spun her around, crashing her against unseen rocks. She broke the surface once, choking, eyes wide with terror, hair plastered across her face, before the river pulled her under again. Daniel saw it happen. From the ridge above, the cowboy's heart thundered in his chest as if it too had been thrown into the torrent. He'd known Clara for years, had loved her in silence through seasons of distance and pride, and now, in a single brutal instant, the thought of losing her ripped him open. He didn't think. Cowboys like him weren't made for hesitation. He tore off his wide-brimmed hat, his boots sinking into the mud as he charged toward the water. The river greeted him like a wall, slamming into his chest the moment he dove. In, cold, relentless, violent. It clawed at his muscles, tried to drag him down, to make him part of its fury. But Daniel was no stranger to battles with wild things. He had broken horses no one else would touch, wrestled cattle from flash floods, stared down storms that split the sky open. And this fight was personal. "Clara," he roared, the sound raw against the roar of the water. Through the chaos he caught sight of her, a flash of turquoise dress swirling like a trapped bird. His arms burned as he pushed forward, stroke after stroke, every muscle screaming against the current. For one terrible second, she disappeared beneath the surface again, and his heart nearly stopped. But then, there, her hand, pale and desperate, broke through the water. He lunged, his fingers closing around hers, strong and unyielding. Her body thrashed in panic, but his grip was iron. "I won't let you go again," he shouted, voice cracking with the weight of more than just the river. Words heavy with history, regret, and a promise that stretched far beyond this moment. Clara's eyes met his then, wild with fear but flickering with something else, something that whispered of trust, of recognition, of all the words they had left unsaid. Together they fought the river. The river finally released them, spitting them out onto the gravel bank like survivors of a shipwreck. Clara collapsed onto the wet stones, coughing, her chest heaving as she dragged in greedy lungfuls of air. Her turquoise dress clung to her like a second skin, soaked and torn, the fabric plastered against her trembling body. Daniel knelt beside her, dripping, his shirt plastered to his frame, his breath ragged but steady. His hands, still rough and strong, hovered over her shoulders as if afraid to let go. Even now that the current had been left behind, for a long moment neither spoke. The roar of the river filled the silence, and above them, the sky darkened as storm clouds rolled in from the west, heavy with rain and thunder. Clara finally lifted her gaze, eyes locking with his, and in them burned 1,000 questions. "Why?" Her voice cracked, more fragile than he had ever heard it. "Why would you risk everything?" Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes shadowed with memories he rarely let anyone see. He could have told her about the nights he spent staring at the stars, wondering if he'd ever have the courage to tell her what she meant to him. He could have told her about the years of silence, the mistakes that had driven them apart, the weight of regret that pressed on his chest heavier than any saddle. But he said only the words that mattered most. "Because I promised myself," he murmured, voice low but steady, "that if I ever had the chance, I'd never let you slip away again." Clara's breath caught, and for the first time since the river had pulled her under, tears filled her eyes, not of fear, but of something raw, something she had buried for far too long. But the storm did not care for tender moments. Thunder rolled across the canyon, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of rain and the sharp sting of electricity. Daniel's head snapped toward the horizon, his instincts honed by years of ranch work and survival. The river was dangerous enough in daylight, but a storm would make it deadly. "We need to move," he said firmly, offering his hand. She hesitated only a heartbeat before sliding her fingers into his. the warmth of his grip anchoring her in the chaos. They began the climb, their boots and bare feet slipping against wet stone. The roar of the river below like a monster still hungry for them. Each step upward was a battle, mud sucking at their feet, branches whipping against their faces, the sky flashing with lightning that turned the world silver for an instant at a time. But Daniel never let go of her hand. And as the storm broke, drenching them with sheets of rain, Clara realized something she had never dared admit to herself before. The river might have tried to take her life, but in its fury, it had also dragged something else into the open, something alive, something undeniable. And Daniel, her cowboy, her savior, her mistake and her second chance, wasn't about to let it go. Morning light spilled gently across the canyon, soft and golden after the violence of the storm. The river, though still restless, had calmed to a steady rhythm, its roar replaced with a whisper that seemed almost apologetic. On the high ridge above, a small fire crackled, its thin smoke curling into the pale sky. Clara sat close to the flames, wrapped in a blanket Daniel had pulled from his saddlebag after he'd gone back for the horses at first light. Her hair, still damp, framed her face in fiery waves, and though exhaustion lingered in her eyes, there was also something new there. Peace. Daniel crouched by the fire, poking at the embers with a stick, his broad shoulders hunched in silence. He had barely slept, choosing instead to keep watch, the storm's chaos still echoing in his bones. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her slipping under the water, saw the moment he nearly lost her forever. The memory was enough to jolt him awake, enough to remind him why he had made the vow he had. Clara's voice broke the quiet. "You never told me what you meant last night." Daniel lifted his gaze, meeting hers across the fire. The words sat heavy on his tongue, words he had carried for years, words that had been silenced by pride and fear. But after nearly losing her, pride had no place anymore. "I meant every word," he said, his voice rough but sure. "I won't let you go again, Clara, not to a river, not to a storm, not to my own mistakes." Her breath caught, the firelight dancing in her eyes. She wanted to protest, to remind him of the years apart, the arguments, the distance. But all of that seemed small now, washed away by the river's fury. What mattered was here, now. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of hope, of forgiveness, of a love that had nearly drowned but refused to die. Daniel reached across the fire, his hand open, waiting. Clara hesitated only for a heartbeat before sliding hers into his. The warmth of his palm was steady, grounding, a promise renewed. For the first time since the river had tried to tear them apart, Clara smiled. And Daniel, the cowboy who had dived into death itself to save her, finally let himself believe that this moment, this love, was worth every battle. The river would run on, wild and untamed, but so would they. Together. The days after the storm settled into a fragile calm. Clara and Daniel rode together across the open plains, the sky above wide and endless, the air sweet with the smell of grass after rain. Each sunrise painted the land in gold, and each sunset wrapped it in fire. But for the first time in years, Clara didn't feel small beneath it all. She felt safe. She felt seen, and she knew why, because Daniel was beside her. Yet peace has a way of testing hearts. As they crossed into the valley where Daniel's ranch stretched like a kingdom of dust and fences, Clara noticed the shadows gathering, men leaning on fence posts, watching with hard eyes, whispers passing between them like rattlesnakes hidden in the grass. Trouble had always followed Daniel, not because he sought it, but because he stood in its way. That night, as the stars burned bright above, Clara found him saddling his horse again, his expression carved with the weight of secrets he hadn't shared. "You saved me from the river," she said softly, stepping closer. "But now it feels like you're drifting away." Daniel paused, his hands stilling on the worn leather straps. He didn't look at her, not at first. The river wasn't the only danger. "Clara, there are men who'd rather see me gone. And if they know you're with me..." His voice trailed, heavy with unspoken fear. Clara's heart tightened. She had thought the battle was behind them, that the storm had been their trial. But now, as the wind whispered through the valley grass and coyotes howled in the distance, she realized their fight was only beginning. She stepped forward, laying her hand over his. "Then whatever comes," she said, her voice firm, "we face it together. You once told me you wouldn't let me go again. Don't think for a second I'll let you go either." Daniel finally looked at her then, and in his eyes, the fire of a man ready to stand against the world burned brighter than ever. The morning broke restless. The wind carried dust across the valley, stirring unease among the cattle and whispers among the men who worked. Daniel's land. Clara rose from the small cabin on the ridge, her heart heavy with the tension that had hung in the air since their return. She could feel it even before the first rider appeared on the horizon. IED. Cloud of grit rising in the distance, the thunder of hooves echoing like war drums. Daniel stood at the corral, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the riders closing in. These weren't neighbors come calling, and Clara knew it. Their silhouettes were sharp against the rising sun, hats low, rifles strapped to their saddles. Trouble had come riding. "Stay inside," Daniel said quietly, his tone leaving no room for argument. But Clara stepped closer instead, her hand brushing his arm, refusing to be pushed aside. "I almost lost you to that river," she whispered fiercely. "Don't ask me to stand by while I lose you to them." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Perhaps he knew there was no arguing with her anymore. Not after the river. Not after the storm. They were bound now, not just by love, but by survival. The riders pulled up, dust swirling around them. At their front was a man with eyes like flint and a smile that cut like a knife. His voice carried easily across the corral. "Daniel Kane," he drawled. "You've been standing in the way of business for too long. Today that ends." The men around him shifted, hands resting on their weapons. Clara's heart pounded, but when she looked at Daniel, she saw no fear, only the calm fire of a man who had already faced death and walked away. He stepped forward, hat pulled low, voice steady. "You want me? Then you'll have to go through more than just me." And as Clara stepped up beside him, chin high, the canyon air thick with tension, the truth was clear. The battle was no longer his alone. The river had tried to tear them apart. The storm had tried to break them. But here, before the fire of men and fate, they would stand together or fall together. The canyon shook with the sound of gunfire. Echoes bounced off the stone walls, mingling with the cries of frightened horses and the sharp smell of gunpowder. Clara ducked behind the splintered remains of a fence post, her hands pressed against her ears as bullets tore through the air. Just a few feet away, Daniel stood tall in the storm, rifle braced against his shoulder, his body outlined in dust and sunlight like a figure carved from the land itself. "Stay low," he shouted, his voice carrying above the chaos. But Clara refused to cower. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, yet her heart anchored her to him. She remembered the river's pull, the storm's fury, and how he had held her against both. She would not abandon him now. Not when flesh and blood men had taken the place of raging waters. The gang that had ridden into the valley came in numbers, their faces twisted with greed, their bullets meant to claim land, pride, and the man who had stood against them for too long. Dust hung in the air like smoke, the sun baking down on a battlefield that had once been quiet pasture. Daniel fired again, dropping another rider from his horse. But the odds were uneven. For every man he sent tumbling into the dirt, two more seemed to rise from the haze. His chest heaved, sweat and grit clinging to his skin. But his eyes were relentless, burning with the fire of a man who had vowed never to let go. A bullet struck the earth inches from Clara, showering her with grit. Fear gripped her chest, but it was not stronger than the determination that had bloomed inside her since the river. Snatching up a fallen revolver from the ground, she rose to her feet. Her hand shook, but her gaze was steady. "Daniel!" she cried, her voice sharp and fierce. "You're not fighting alone!" He turned, shock flashing across his face, for only a heartbeat before it was replaced with something else, pride. In the middle of dust and blood, Clara Kane, once a woman swept away, now stood unshaken, a storm of her own. Together they faced the tide. The gang closed in, a wall of riders and steel. The valley roared with fire, with fury, with fate. But Daniel and Clara stood shoulder to shoulder, hearts bound not by chance, but by choice. The river had tested them. The storm had scarred them. But here, in the fire and dust, they would carve their own ending.